Chapter 2, Reason and Emotion. The aim of this tutorial is to help you learn the basics of critical thinking and be able to identify common barriers to effective critical thought, especially when it comes to reason and emotion, which can both cloud and enhance our ability to think clearly. So the learning outcomes for this section is to learn what is reason, the role of emotion in critical thinking, artificial intelligence, reason and emotion, and faith and reason. So reason is simply the process of supporting a claim or conclusion based on evidence. It's not an opinion, it's not what you think, it is based on evidence, and it involves both disciplined use of intelligence and the applications of rules for problem solving. In logic, reason is presented in a structured form supported by premises. We're going to go through that in later classes, but that is all you need to know at this point. Reason contains a number of important components and strategies, and these components include the ability to engage in abstract thinking and behavioral modification. Reason also involves the ability to embrace different cognitive strategies such as deduction, generalization, and imagination. These are all thinking skills. It is important in problem-solving skills such as mathematics, engineering, and architecture. Okay, great chain of being. So they used to believe that the ability to reason was passed down from God, that only human beings had higher levels of rational thinking, and that was given to us by God. So God is at the top, and then angels and demons, and then man is somewhere in the middle, followed by animals, plants, minerals. Today, we know a little bit more about reasoning and rationality, and that there are lots of animals out there that have both independent thoughts, emotions, and the ability to rationalize. So Aristotle was one of the first ones that really linked this idea of rational thinking being a male thing. You know, men are able to think rationally, women are largely emotional, and that there's a difference in the way that a man's brain is wired to think rationally, and women's brain might be reasoned or wired differently to think maybe more from the emotional components. We know that's no longer true, and we know in order to be an effective critical thinker, we must be willing to use both reason and cognitive, straightforward thinking to really challenge the assumptions of gendered and age-based thinking, right? We know that no longer do we believe that females have a certain cognitive ability and reasoning structure, and males have a different one. Reason can operate at both the subconscious and conscious levels, and traditionally seen as conscious activity. Recent cognitive research suggests that much of the reasoning is in fact unconscious and automatic. So a lot of the ways you make decisions aren't necessarily conscious, right? A lot of it happens subconsciously. And a good example of this is when they've looked at dreams, and they know that the activity of your brain when you're dreaming is often higher than it is when you're awake. And so they've also discovered that you solve a lot of your problems in your dreams, that you might go to bed with a problem or an issue, and you wake up and suddenly you have the solution. And a good example is the periodic table that occurred. The Russian chemist that came up with that said a lot of it was delivered to him through dreams, and that's how he came up with the periodic table. Reason helps us analyze beliefs and evidence, and to make good life choices, and to cope with adversity and to resolve problems. And critical thinking reason does not operate alone, but it works together with other faculties such as emotion. So our emotions definitely play into our thinking, and they impact our thinking. And we're going to learn later that sometimes it impacts it in positive ways, and other times it is deterrent from thinking clearly. So emotion, quite simply, is a state of consciousness in which we feel feelings. Joy, anger, love, hate, fear. These are all emotions. And in Western culture, emotion has been traditionally viewed as the opposite of reason. So you can't both be emotional and thinking clearly. In contrast, other cultures have emphasized the importance of positive emotions in developing critical thinking. So now I think we've reached kind of a balance where we feel that some emotions are positive and will help us think clearly and inform us to make decisions, where other emotions actually make us more narrow-minded, and they deter us from thinking clearly. So they've grouped this into two types of emotions. Dangerous emotions such as anger and fear are often barriers to critical thinking. When you hear someone get in an argument, they say, "I don't want to hear anymore. I've heard enough. I'm not interested in your side of the argument." Those things impede your thinking. But then if you're empathetic and you're compassionate, often those open you up to thinking better, right? To thinking more clearly, to thinking more openly. So now we know that certain emotions will help you become a better critical thinker, and other ones will hinder you. This is especially true if you're going into the healthcare field. I can't think of any way that being an emotional and compassionate healthcare worker would hurt you, right? Would make you an ineffective worker, right? Those are definitely qualities that would improve your ability to be really good at your job. Here's Rosa Parks. And for those of you who do not know who Rosa Parks is, she was the individual that sparked a huge movement during the time where we had racial segregation both in the US and in Canada. And she was the one that allowed her emotions on a day that she had worked a long shift and sitting on a bus when a white man told her to stand up to let him take the seat. Rosa Parks refused. And it wasn't because she had thought about this a lot and it was a rational decision. She was doing it because she was tired and probably feeling like she was done being pushed around. And so there's a good example about how emotion impacted her decision, and how this decision really created positive change in the world. So your emotions can definitely have a positive impact. Emotional intelligence, this is often cited as being far more important than your skills in a job, and it is the ability to perceive, appraise, express, and regulate emotion in positively regulated ways. As you can imagine, with a job, having a high emotional intelligence would serve you very well. And emotions, as we said, such as empathy, love, happiness, and even guilt, can positively influence your decisions. An empathetic person is more flexible and they're more open to other perspectives, whereas someone who is angry and bitter obviously is not. So emotion does play an important role in being a good critical thinker, and positive emotions help enhance it, and negative emotions often hurt your ability to think critically. And here's an example, right? Negative emotions can create prejudice. They can create fear. They can create a scarcity mindset. They can create paranoia, and all of those things, obviously impact your thinking. The other thing that you have to understand is that we're often vulnerable to our emotions, right? When we see an advertisement that is supposed to invoke fear or pity or a political message, that can impact our thinking. And so we have to be very aware that these organizations and individuals use our emotions to impact our thinking and impede our thinking, right? A lot of marketing is kind of designed to make you feel like maybe you're missing out, like the fear of if you don't have this latest product, or if you don't look a certain way, that you're not going to fit in. And that is based on fear, right? It's not based on compassion. It's not based on empathy. It's not based on love or understanding. It's simply based on creating a fear that you may not be accepted, that you may not be included. And that is something we need to be aware of, acutely aware of. Using our emotions in conjunction with reason allows us to make better informed decisions. Absolutely. So the Mozart effect, for those of you who are not aware, was a study done where they believed a long time ago that listening to classical music makes you smarter. And based on that, a whole bunch of people started creating books and CDs and products that included classical music for babies. And what they've discovered is that the Mozart effect really is not anything significant. That listening to classical music is not going to make you smarter. They did discover that all music stimulates your brain, it stimulates thinking, and it may have some small benefits to the way that your mind works. But certainly, listening to Mozart is not going to make you smarter in any significant way. Artificial intelligence. This is a really interesting time to be discussing this, because artificial intelligence is in the news more and more these days because of how good it's getting. And for those of you who are not aware of what artificial intelligence is, it's defined as the study of computations that make it possible to perceive, reason, and act. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to enhance human reasoning by using machines and artificial intelligence. And you can imagine how effective this can be when maybe crowdsourcing a diagnosis in the medical field, right? Where you're able to plug into computer symptoms and the artificial intelligence is able to gather information from thousands or even millions of doctors around the world, or healthcare practitioners, and come to maybe a more accurate diagnosis, or maybe a menu of diagnosis that may apply to an individual. And you can see how that may be really beneficial, especially in tougher cases. Yeah, a lot of people may be worried about emotional intelligence and feeling that, it's going to end up like the movie Terminator, where artificial intelligence takes over the world. But we need to be open to it and understand that there's some enormous potential to enhance our ability to think critically, right? Because part of thinking critically is having access to sound information, evidence-based information, right? Information is not necessarily based on a hunch or a feeling, but is based in evidence and a number of people's opinions. So it's not something to be feared. So faith involves not only the belief in God, but also an act of trust and obedience in God. And so integrating reason into faith allows us to evaluate the competing claims of faith and revelation, and to question faith-based claims that are inconsistent with evidence and reason. And so a good example of this may be that our faith in the past doesn't necessarily align with our beliefs today. And you can see this a lot with the Pope and the Catholic Church. And over the last few years, they've accepted gay marriage, certain women's rights in the reproductive decisions, and things that align well with maybe the faith, but not the way the religion stated it previously. So that's a good example of how we must integrate both reason and faith, and question when our faith is inconsistent with the best evidence or reason. And Mother Teresa is a great example of how she let her faith inform her life and her decisions in giving back in all the tremendous ways that she did. And she used that faith to then guide her action, right? So there are three approaches to faith and reason. Fedenism argues that faith transcends reason, and that really we should base all our decisions in faith in revelation and not through reason and empirical evidence. And there are millions of people on earth that do this. They ignore empirical evidence and they say, well, in my holy book or in my community or my God believes this. And because of that, it has got to be true and it's the way I'm going to live my life. So there's a lot of people that believe in this and that live their life that way. And then there's an opposite end of the spectrum, and that's rationalism. And they argue that religious belief should be consistent with reason and evidence, and that anything that doesn't follow reason and evidence is not a sound belief. And there's a middle ground here, and it is critical rationalism, and that argues that divine knowledge can derive from both faith and reason. So maybe there's a combination. Maybe you can use both sources as a way to guide your thinking, that you can take your beliefs and take your faith, but then use the empirical reasoning and evidence to ensure that you're making a decision or living in a way that aligns with both your faith and reason and evidence. So Abraham and his son, this is a good example if you're not familiar with the story. In the Bible, God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son to God. And this is something that is not new, right? There's lots of examples throughout our history where we had both animal and human sacrifices, that people believe that murdering animals and murdering people was something that God wanted. But I would think that in today's age, if you murdered someone and your defense was that God told you to, I don't think there's many people that would think that was a sound defense, that would say, okay, well, we're going to let this person off because God told them to murder this person. So we must use both our faith and reason and evidence to make those types of decisions. So, as previous slides have shown, effective critical thinkers require exercises in both reason and emotion in order to be effective. You can't really be like a robot and not expect reason to impact your emotion, but then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you can't let your anger and your fear drive all of your decisions. And also, reason and faith are compatible. They don't necessarily need to be separate. Okay, so that is a brief overview of the major concepts and learning outcomes in Chapter 2. I hope that you found that information useful. If you have any of those questions about any of that, please don't hesitate to contact me.